Yesterday, Forbes released its 35 annual Billionaires list, and in a year that wreaked economic havoc on a lot of the world, 493 new billionaires were actually added to that list. The total net worth was $8 trillion higher than the last year.
Co-host of the Bad Faith podcast, contributing editor at Current Affairs, and former national press secretary for the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, Briahna Joy Gray, joins us now to discuss. Great to see you, Bri.
Good to see you, Briahna.
Great.
The amount of wealth that was accumulated by these billionaires, the amount of new billionaires who were added to the list is truly astonishing, especially at a time, in a year that for many people was the worst year of their lives, both economically and personally. Why do you think that this is significant?
For years, the argument from the very rich and their allies has been that there is no relationship between the obscene aggregation of wealth by fewer and fewer people at the very, very top and the growing inequality and the poor outcomes for everyone else in the country. And I don't think it is an accident. In fact, I know it's not an accident that during a year that was marked by such enormous economic and personal crisis by so many people, the rich got richer and richer. Recently, we had Representative Ro Khanna on our show, and we asked him if billionaires should exist, and he gave an answer that's pretty common amongst folks who say, I don't think that we should ban billionaires. I don't think that that's the issue. But that is, in fact, a problem. The fact that people being able to get that much money doesn't come without a cost. And whether or not you want to embrace, want to talk about kind of labor theory of capital and get into Marxism is kind of beside the point. The reality is that we have seen a correlation between income inequality and the fates of the 99% and the growth of the 1%. And you cannot have a win-win scenario where you don't challenge the aggregation of wealth at the top if you expect the fates of everybody else to improve.
One thing I've always tried to highlight for people, Briahna, is about the way that people become billionaires in America. And it's very clear here from the way that you enter the new billionaire list. It's either already be a billionaire or be born into a billionaire family or engage in some cockamamie schemes involving algorithms on Wall Street. Like, this is not a productive way in order to enrich people in society, especially if that enrichment comes at the cost of somebody else.
Yeah, and look, when you look at the media coverage of Biden's kind of, fine, but not exactly revolutionary attempts to start to raise the corporate tax rate, et cetera, and the backdrop of these enormous gains for billionaires, right? The coverage is very, critical. All of the Wall Street press, the corporate press, is acting as though he is wielding an attack on the rich, as opposed to balancing what has been a long-term attack on everyone else that's been going on for decades. We used to have a 53% tax on corporate profits. We used to have a 94% marginal tax rate at a point at which there was a lot more equality in the country. And that's before we even get to the really devastating effects that having that kind of aggregation of wealth at the top has on our democracy. We just came out of a Democratic primary season where Michael Bloomberg, who at the time I believe was the 9th richest man in the world, was able to buy his way into a campaign and onto the ballot and basically hold himself out as the last case scenario for what corporate Dems could do if Bernie Sanders happened to inch ahead, simply because he had personal wealth, not because he was able to fundraise from the people or there was any grassroots interest in him running for office. And that is enormously damaging and frankly just more evidence of the fact that we do live in an oligarchy.
Yeah, I also think that these numbers really underscore how actually inadequate Biden's plans are. And we covered here how Bezos is like, yeah, I'm cool with upping the marginal tax rate on corporations a little bit because we all know that Amazon's not going to pay those taxes anyway. But some of the other numbers that are revealed here, so in the United States, the top 400 wealthiest Americans now own the equivalent of 18% of GDP in wealth. That's twice as much as in just 2010. So in a decade, they've doubled their amount of wealth as a percent of GDP. And meanwhile, the political answer is to claw back like a tiny little marginal, irrelevant bit of that. And even that, the business lobby will go to the mat over.
Right. We had 9 times more billionaires in 2020. That's before all of this growth we're talking about. We had 9 times more billionaires in 2020 than we did in 1990. 9 times. And I think that people really have a hard time wrapping their brain around how much money a billion really is. And at the same time that we see those numbers, we're having these vigorous public conversations about whether people who have taken on hundreds of thousands of student debt or $30,000 of student debt, $50,000 of student debt should be able to have that debt canceled. We're having robust conversations about whether unemployment checks should be $300 or $400. We're having tiresome, endless conversations about whether or not the $2,000 check promise was really $2,000 or $600. All at the same time that these billionaires are making more in a second for, to Sagar's point, unproductive activity at the same time. And again, I think that the reason they get away with this is because people aren't drawing enough of a connection between the fact of that wealth aggregation and what that means in terms of wages stolen from the people that are working for those institutions. And if we don't start having a more robust conversation about how wealth is created and on whose backs that wealth is created, billionaires and millionaires are going to keep getting away with basically wage theft for the rest of all time. This, again, is not a war on the wealthy. It's an effort to rebalance the effects of a war that has been waged for decades and that we're seeing the results of now in both our economic crisis and our social and personal crisis.
Yeah, really important points, Briahna. Thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Great to have you, Bri. Great to see you.
Of course.
Turns out Trump loyalist Matt Gaetz has sought a preemptive blanket pardon from the former president. We're going to discuss that when Rising continues.